July 2, 1943. Castel Vetrono Airfield, Sicily. The Sicilian sun burned across the cracked tarmac, its heat shimmering like a mirage over the airfield. From above, the sky seemed endless, a canvas of blue and smoke and flame. A lone Focke-Wulf 190 twisted through the air, its silver fuselage catching the sunlight. The German pilot never saw the P-40 Warhawk diving from the heavens until the roar of 50-caliber machine guns tore through his wings. The fighter shuddered, trailing black smoke, before spiraling downward into the olive-green countryside below. From his cockpit, First Lieutenant Charles B. Hall steadied his breathing. The faint smell of gunpowder lingered inside his oxygen mask. At 22 years old, a young man from Brazil, Indiana, he had just made history, though he didn't know it yet. Below, the wreckage of the German aircraft burned quietly, its black cross stark against the earth. For Hall, it was one more enemy destroyed. For the world, it was something greater. A black American pilot had just shot down one of Nazi Germany's finest fighters, something their racial ideology claimed could never happen. Inside Luftwaffe command posts, disbelief rippled through intelligence channels. Reports described the encounter, a P-40 Warhawk flown by a Negro pilot. To the Reich, it was unthinkable. Nazi racial doctrine declared men like Charles Hall as Untermensch, subhuman, incapable of mastering modern technology, much less the deadly art of air combat. Yet here, above the Mediterranean skies, one young man had just punctured that delusion with bullets and truth. The swastika that ground crews would later paint on Hall's Warhawk symbolized more than victory. It marked the beginning of a reckoning. Across the Atlantic, in a segregated America that doubted its own black citizens, a new chapter had begun. But this story did not begin in Sicily. It began decades earlier in a nation still divided by color lines. In 1925, the United States Army War College released a report titled Employment of Negro Manpower in War. It declared that black men were inherently weak in character and inferior in mentality. These words, written by American officers, codified a prejudice that reached into every barracks and classroom. They said black soldiers lacked the courage to lead, the intellect to command, and the steadiness to fight. It was not science. It was fear dressed as policy. Yet, even as those words hardened into doctrine, a few men and women quietly defied them. In 1917, during the First World War, a young man named Eugene Bullard had crossed the ocean to France because his own country would not let him fly. Bullard became the world's first black combat pilot, fighting under the French flag. In 1921, a woman named Bessie Coleman earned her pilot's license in France as well, after every American flight school had turned her away. And in the 1930s in Chicago, the Coffey School of Aeronautics trained dozens of black civilian pilots, proving that skill and ambition could thrive even in the narrowest spaces allowed. When war returned to Europe, those quiet achievements became a weapon. Civil rights leaders, Walter White of the NAACP, labor organizer A. Philip Randolph, and Judge William H. Hastie, began to pressure Washington. They wrote letters, staged meetings, and challenged America's conscience. Black newspapers like the Chicago Defender and the Pittsburgh Courier asked one devastating question: how can America fight for freedom abroad while denying it at home? By 1939, the pressure could no longer be ignored. Congress passed Public Law 18, which required the inclusion of at least one school to train black pilots under the Civilian Pilot Training Program. It was a small door, reluctantly opened, but through it would walk giants. When Franklin Roosevelt prepared for his third term in 1940, he needed black votes in northern cities. On January 16, 1941, the U.S. War Department announced something unprecedented: the creation of the 99th Pursuit Squadron, an all-black flying unit. Officially, it was called an experiment. Unofficially, it was a test of a race. Captain Benjamin O. Davis, Jr., a man forged in quiet endurance, was chosen to lead them. At West Point, no white cadet had spoken to him for 4 years except on official duty. He knew isolation intimately. Now he commanded 26 pilots from a place called Tuskegee, Alabama, men who would bear the hopes of millions. In the spring of 1943, their journey carried them across the Atlantic to North Africa. The 99th Fighter Squadron arrived at a dusty airstrip in Tunisia, attached to the 33rd Fighter Group under Colonel William M. Maumeyer, a commander who believed they would fail. He kept them on minor patrols, distant, uneventful missions, while other squadrons earned glory. When they didn't shine immediately, he filed reports claiming they lacked aggressiveness. The men knew the truth. They were being judged not as pilots, but as proof of a nation's prejudice. Their first combat mission came on June 2, 1943, a raid on the Italian-held island of Pantelleria. German fighters attacked. The Tuskegee pilots held firm, defending their bombers with discipline, not flair. No aircraft were lost. The Germans learned something that day. These men would not break. 1 month later, they did more than endure. They made history. As Charles Hall's bullets found their mark above Sicily, the shouts that erupted across the airfield below were not just for a victory. They were for vindication. Black mechanics who had endured slurs and mockery from white crews threw their caps into the air. For the first time, they had proof written in smoke and fire. Hall's kill marked the first confirmed aerial victory by a black pilot in U.S. history. To the Germans, it was an anomaly. To Hall's comrades, it was revelation. In Berlin, analysts within the Luftwaffe Intelligence Bureau took note. The pilots of the Negerstaffel, as they called them at first, were reportedly flying with increasing skill. Some commanders dismissed the reports as propaganda. Others, quietly, did not. The enemy had begun to see what America still refused to acknowledge. By early 1944, the 99th Fighter Squadron had been in combat for 7 months. Their commander's skepticism turned to hostility. Colonel Maumeyer filed another report urging their removal from combat. The message climbed the chain of command to General Henry Hap Arnold, head of the Army Air Forces. The experiment, it seemed, had run its course. Then came Anzio, January the 27th, 1944. Over the beaches of Anzio, 15 pilots of the 99th Fighter Squadron faced waves of German fighters. Their P-40 Warhawks were slower, their engines older, their radios unreliable. But their discipline held. In 2 days of savage fighting, they destroyed between 8 and 13 enemy aircraft. Charles Hall added 2 more to his record. The 99th had turned skepticism into silence. In Washington, a War Department study compared their performance with other P-40 units. The conclusion was unequivocal. They were equal in skill, equal in courage, equal in every measure that mattered. For Benjamin Davis, Jr., it was the vindication of years of endurance. For his men, it was proof that discipline could shatter disbelief. When the 99th was folded into the newly formed 332nd Fighter Group in the spring of 1944, they carried with them the pride of victory and the scars of contempt. They would soon become legends, but not yet. At that time, they were simply soldiers doing their duty in a world reluctant to see them as equals. In the skies above the Mediterranean, the Germans prepared for new encounters. In mess halls and briefing rooms, Luftwaffe pilots spoke of the Americans with red markings on their planes. Some called them ghosts, disciplined, silent, always there. Others mocked them, refusing to believe the rumors that they were black. But the truth, as it so often does, was waiting in the clouds. By May 1944, the men of Tuskegee were no longer an experiment. They were a weapon. The 99th Pursuit Squadron was joined by 3 more, the 100th, 301st, and 302nd, to form the 332nd Fighter Group. Their new commander, Colonel Benjamin O. Davis, Jr., carried with him a quiet resolve. Years of silence at West Point had taught him the value of composure. Now, as he stood before his pilots at Ramitelli Airfield on Italy's Adriatic coast, his voice carried calm authority. "We cannot afford to lose bombers," he told them. "Our job is not to be aces. Our job is to bring those bombers home." It was a philosophy that would define them and earn them immortality. That summer, the United States Army Air Forces prepared for one of the most dangerous stages of the war: deep penetration bombing raids into the heart of Nazi Germany. Thousands of heavy bombers, B-17, Flying Fortresses, and B-24 Liberators, would strike at oil refineries, tank factories, and transportation hubs, crippling the Reich's capacity to fight. But their survival depended on escort fighters capable of staying with them for the entire journey. 800 miles in and 800 miles out, through skies teeming with German interceptors. The 332nd was assigned to the 15th Air Force, flying from Italy into the very core of Hitler's empire. Their aircraft, the P-51 Mustang, represented the pinnacle of American engineering. Sleek, powerful, and, above all, fast. With its Packard-built Merlin engine, the Mustang could climb higher and fly farther than any fighter before it. For the men of Tuskegee, the P-51 was more than an aircraft. It was freedom. In June 1944, General Nathan Twining ordered every fighter group to paint distinctive markings on their tails for identification. For the 332nd, the color was red, not just on the tails, but on the spinners, the nosebands, the wingtips. Under the Mediterranean sun, their aircraft gleamed crimson like blood against silver. The red tails were born. When the first bomber crews saw them, they didn't know who their protectors were. They only knew these fighters stayed close, steady, disciplined, and unwavering. While other escorts chased after easy kills, the red tails refused to abandon their posts. Over the months that followed, bomber crews began requesting them by name. "Get us the red tails," they'd say. "They bring us home." From the ground, the Germans noticed too. Reports began to filter through Luftwaffe channels describing a new American unit flying in tight, impenetrable formations. Their discipline was unnerving. Schwarze Vogelmännchen, some called them. Black birdmen. Others refused to believe it. "Propaganda," said one pilot. "Negroes cannot fly Mustangs." Yet the wreckage scattered across Europe told another story. On July 18, 1944, the 332nd would face their greatest test. Colonel Davis led 66 Mustangs north toward southern Germany. Their mission: escort bombers attacking the Luftwaffe base at Memmingen. It was a clear day. Too clear. Visibility stretched for miles, and the German radar operators at their posts near Munich saw everything. As the American formation crossed into enemy airspace, the call went out. "Achtung! Feindverband! Enemy formation approaching." Within minutes, 100 German fighters, Messerschmitt Bf-109s and Focke-Wulf 190s, scrambled into the air. From the bombers' cockpits, the sky turned into chaos. Silver bombers lumbered forward while black crosses dived from above. The red tails rose to meet them. For 20 minutes, the sky over Bavaria became a storm of tracer fire. Lieutenant Clarence Lester, known as Lucky, locked onto a Focke-Wulf turning into the sun. He squeezed the trigger, watched the German's canopy explode in flame, and rolled clear. Nearby, Joseph Ellsbury downed 3 enemy fighters in one mission. When the smoke cleared, 15 bombers had fallen, but hundreds had survived because the red tails refused to break formation. 3 American pilots didn't return that day: Robert Hutton, Wellington Irving, Alfred Brown. They were buried in foreign soil, far from home, beneath small white crosses. Yet their legacy soared higher than any of their aircraft ever had. In Berlin, Luftwaffe officers examined gun camera footage from the encounter. They watched American Mustangs, painted with red tails, diving through formations, firing with surgical precision. For the first time, they began to admit what had once been heresy. These pilots were not to be underestimated. By late 1944, the air war was changing. The Luftwaffe, once feared across Europe, was now bleeding pilots faster than it could replace them. But even cornered, it remained dangerous, and Germany had one final weapon, a machine that seemed to belong to another era. The Messerschmitt Me-262, the world's first operational jet fighter. It was faster than anything in the sky. Its twin engines could propel it past 540 miles per hour, nearly 100 faster than the Mustang. It could climb, strike, and vanish before propeller-driven fighters could react. For the Allied bomber crews, it was a nightmare. To protect against these jets, the 15th Air Force turned to the Red Tails. March 24, 1945. The mission: escort a massive bomber force to Berlin, over 1,600 miles round trip, targeting the Daimler-Benz tank factory. The Red Tails would be flying into the heart of the Reich, facing whatever the Luftwaffe had left to give. Colonel Davis led 43 Mustangs across the Alps and into Germany. Below them stretched a landscape scarred by years of war. Burned towns, skeletal factories, black ribbons of railway. The closer they drew to Berlin, the clearer the contrails became. Enemy aircraft. "Jets!" someone shouted. In the distance, thin black dots shimmered against the sun, closing fast. Then they were upon them. Messerschmitt 262s, their silver bodies streaking past with impossible speed. For a moment, the air seemed to split in two. Lieutenant Roscoe Brown, leading his flight, studied the enemy's movement. "We knew we couldn't outrun them," he recalled later, "but we could outthink them." He waited, then turned suddenly into the path of a jet diving at the bombers. His Mustang trembled under the G-force. He fired. 3 long bursts from 2,000 feet. The jet burst into flame. The German pilot ejected, his parachute opening against a sky that belonged to neither victor nor vanquished. Nearby, Lieutenant Earl Lane executed one of the most remarkable shots of the war. A 2,000-yard deflection, striking another Me-262 with the new K-14 computing gun sight. Lieutenant Charles Brantley claimed a third. In a single engagement, the 332nd destroyed more German jets than most entire Allied groups would in the entire war. When the Red Tails landed that evening, the sun was setting over Ramitelli. The airfield was quiet except for the slow ticking of cooling engines. 3 German jets destroyed. Bombers returned safely. Another impossible day made possible. The mission would earn them the Distinguished Unit Citation, and with it, a place in history. But behind the triumph lay quiet exhaustion. The men of the 332nd had flown more than 15,000 sorties, through flak, storms, and disbelief. Their aircraft were often old, their supplies scarce, their accommodations meager. At Ramitelli, their tents flooded when it rained. Their rations arrived days late. Yet their aircraft readiness rate, the percentage of planes combat-ready each morning, equaled that of white units stationed at fully equipped bases. It was a miracle of discipline and faith. While their pilots fought the enemy in the air, their ground crews waged war on the ground. Mechanics, armorers, and crew chiefs who worked through the night with worn tools and dwindling parts. On March 24, 1944, a German bombing raid struck Ramitelli. Several ground crew were killed, yet others continued pulling planes to safety, shielding them with their own bodies from burning fuel. They received no medals, but without them, no Red Tail would ever have taken off. And still, despite everything, they smiled. In the photographs that survive, young men standing beside their Mustangs, the red tails gleaming in sunlight, there is pride, but also restraint. They knew their greatest battle was not in the skies over Germany, but in the hearts of those waiting at home. In the Reich, the name Red Tails was spoken with grudging respect. Pilots briefed for missions over Italy and Austria were warned, "Beware the red-tailed Americans. They will not run." To the bomber crews of the 15th Air Force, they were angels. angels with machine guns and crimson wings. The numbers told a story that even skeptics could not ignore. Over 179 bomber escort missions, bombers under red tail protection lost only 27 aircraft to enemy fighters. The average for other P-51 groups was 46. Statistically, the red tails were the best escorts in the United States Army Air Forces. But numbers could not capture what it felt like. The vibration through the cockpit floor, the scent of oil and cordite, the sound of voices on the radio, voices that had once been silenced by prejudice, now calling targets, coordinating attacks, leading formations across an entire continent. They had proved that excellence had no color, and yet, back home, that truth was still waiting to be recognized. When the war's end began to glimmer on the horizon, the men of the 332nd Fighter Group had already written their chapter in the sky. Yet their journey, like so many American stories, was far from finished. In February 1945, bad weather grounded flights for nearly 2 weeks at Ramitelli. The airfield, once buzzing with propellers and radio chatter, fell silent except for the soft hum of generators and the crackle of distant thunder. Inside the damp tents, the men waited, writing letters home, cleaning weapons, tuning engines. Some thought about the day they'd finally return to America, imagining parades and homecomings. Others, more quietly, wondered if the world that had doubted them would now finally see them. Then came a day none would forget. March 24, 1945, the same mission to Berlin that earned them the Distinguished Unit citation. Not every pilot made it home. One of them was Lieutenant Walter Manning. His P-51 was hit by anti-aircraft fire near Austria. He bailed out, parachuting safely into a small village. But when the local townspeople realized he was a black pilot, their anger turned violent. Before German soldiers could intervene, a mob seized him. He was beaten and lynched. His body was hung in public, a grotesque display of hatred, not just for the enemy, but for the color of his skin. Even in death, prejudice crossed all borders. News of Manning's fate spread quietly through the red tails. They did not speak of it often. They simply flew harder, straighter, tighter. Their grief was forged into resolve. Every mission after that became personal. In the skies above Europe, they had become legends. But on the ground, reality remained unchanged. At Naples, a transport ship loaded with American troops was preparing to sail home. Officers stood at the gangway with clipboards, checking off names. When the red tails arrived, still wearing their uniforms, still carrying the weight of war, a white officer stopped them. "Negro personnel board last," he said coldly. "That's Army policy." They obeyed, wordlessly. They had spent years obeying, and yet they had done what no one thought possible. They had escorted bombers over Berlin, destroyed the world's first jet fighters, and flown more than 15,000 sorties without a single mutiny, strike, or failure of discipline. But their reward was a reminder that victory abroad did not guarantee justice at home. Among those waiting in line was Captain Roscoe Brown. He looked back at the ship, the flag snapping in the wind, and muttered to a friend, "We fought to destroy fascism, and it is still waiting for us on the dock." In the months after VE Day, the 332nd continued to patrol the skies of Italy, escorting transports, ferrying dignitaries, and mapping damage from the air. Then came the order they had long awaited: return to the United States. Their journey home took them through ports, rail cars, and bus stations, all under the same system they had left behind. At bases in Virginia, Georgia, and Illinois, colored signs still hung over mess halls and latrines. Even the officers in Kitiu Club at Freeman Field refused entry to the very men who had bled for freedom. When a group of black officers, led by Lieutenant Coleman Young and Lieutenant Roger Terry, entered the White Officers Club in protest, they were arrested. For days, military police surrounded the base. The event became known as the Freeman Field Mutiny. Not a riot, not a rebellion, but a demand for dignity. Colonel Davis, their commander, intervened quietly, reminding his men that history would remember how they conducted themselves. "We will not fight with fists," he said. "We will fight with excellence." It was the same creed that had carried them through war. Meanwhile, across the Atlantic, their reputation had spread to every Allied airfield in Europe. Bomber crews who had once doubted their abilities now spoke their name with reverence. In briefing tents, commanders recounted stories of the red tails holding formation through flat clouds so thick that sunlight disappeared. Pilots described looking out their side windows at 30,000 feet, seeing red-tailed Mustangs flying close enough to count the rivets, silent guardians who never wavered. When word of the 332nd's performance reached General Eisenhower's headquarters, even the skeptics were forced to acknowledge the truth. A confidential report submitted to the War Department concluded that the performance of the Negro pilots has been beyond question and among the best of all escort groups. Yet, back home, headlines were few. The newspapers that had once doubted them now simply ignored them. The Great War was ending, and America was eager to move on, to new industries, new suburbs, new dreams. But for the men of Tuskegee, the battle was just beginning. Many returned to civilian life only to find that airlines refused to hire them. Pilots who had flown over Berlin and Vienna were told they could not even fly domestic mail routes. Some became teachers, others mechanics. A few joined the newly formed U.S. Air Force, hoping that a new branch might mean a new start. For Colonel Benjamin O. Davis, Jr., that start came slowly but surely. He stayed, rising through the ranks, eventually becoming the first African-American general in the U.S. Air Force. His leadership would inspire generations, not just of black pilots, but of all who understood that courage was colorblind. In Germany, after the surrender, the Luftwaffe pilots who survived captivity began to hear stories of the Red Tails. In POW camps, they shared rumors about a disciplined American unit that had guarded bombers with surgical precision. Rot Schwänze, they called them. The Red Tails. One German ace, interviewed years later, admitted, "When we saw red tails, we knew our chances were small. They flew like machines, not men." It was a backhanded tribute, but it carried truth. The men of Tuskegee had fought two wars, one against tyranny abroad, the other against prejudice at home, and they had won both, though the second would take a lifetime. In time, their story began to resurface, in whispers, then in speeches, then in history books. And yet, for decades, their recognition came too slowly, their medals too late. The war had changed the world, but not all hearts with it. At cemeteries across Italy and France, white crosses mark the graves of Tuskegee Airmen who never came home. Their names are carved in quiet rows among thousands of others. No special distinction, no note of their color, only the simple inscription, United States Army Air Forces. Under those words lies a truth far greater than any monument could capture. That in the moment of sacrifice, the boundaries of race, rank, and reputation dissolve. Only courage remains. By the time the last mission was flown and the last engine fell silent, the Red Tails had destroyed over 260 enemy aircraft, sunk a destroyer, and earned more than 150 distinguished flying crosses. They had changed not only the war, but the idea of what America could be. And yet, when they marched in parades or stood in uniform at home, some still heard whispers. "Experiment," they said, but the experiment had long since become proof. The war ended. The world exhaled. But for the Red Tails, peace brought a strange silence, one far heavier than gunfire. At Ramatelli, the airfield that had once roared with engines now lay quiet under the Mediterranean sun. The runways cracked, the tents sagged, and the P-51s, once polished to mere brightness, sat idle, their red tails fading under layers of dust. Mechanics who had once worked through nights now packed their tools into crates. Pilots who had flown hundreds of missions stood together for one last photograph, unaware that decades would pass before the world truly remembered their names. The orders came in August 1945. The 332nd Fighter Group was to return to the United States and be deactivated. Colonel Benjamin O. Davis, Jr. read the telegram twice before folding it silently. They had done everything their country had asked of them. Now, their country no longer knew what to do with them. At Lockbourne Army Air Base in Ohio, the men gathered for the final time. The ceremony was brief. A few words from an officer, a salute, the lowering of a flag. No brass band, no fanfare. Then, one by one, the pilots walked away from the only family they had known in the war. The hangars emptied. The red tails disappeared from the sky. Years passed. In America's new age of prosperity, the story of the Tuskegee Airmen faded into footnotes. Schoolbooks barely mentioned them. Hollywood found heroes in others. White pilots, white generals, white saviors. The men of the 332nd returned quietly to ordinary lives. Some found work in government or teaching. Others drove buses or repaired engines. They rarely spoke of the war. For many, the silence was self-defense. To speak of heroism was to invite disbelief. When Charles McGee, who had flown 137 combat missions, applied for a job with an airline, the interviewer smiled politely. "You people did well," he said, "but we're not ready for that yet." Still, McGee smiled back. He knew something the world did not, that history had already been written above the clouds. As the 1950s dawned, a new war erupted in Korea. This time, the U.S. Air Force was no longer segregated. President Truman's Executive Order 9981 had officially ended racial discrimination in the armed forces. On paper, equality had arrived. In reality, it was only beginning. Colonel Davis, now wearing the silver eagles of a full colonel, returned to combat command. His leadership shaped a new generation of pilots who would fight under one flag, one uniform, without the barriers that had once defined him. The Tuskegee legacy lived on in their flight manuals, in their discipline, and in the unspoken code passed from instructor to cadet. Never abandon your wingman. But for most of the original Red Tails, life had moved on without ceremony. In small American towns, you could still find them decades later, sitting on porches, reading newspapers, tending gardens. Old men who had once flown higher than most would ever dream. Neighbors would see them at the post office, never knowing that the man before them had once dueled jet fighters over Berlin. Then, in the 1960s, as the civil rights movement ignited across America, the old pilots began to speak again. They saw the same courage in the marchers of Selma that they had once seen in the skies of Europe. They wrote letters, gave interviews, and slowly the truth resurfaced. Television documentaries rediscovered their story. Reporters found dusty logbooks and faded photographs. Newspapers began to print the phrase "Red Tails" again, not as experiment, but as excellence. And when the Smithsonian Institution requested artifacts for its new Air and Space Museum, one of the first donations to arrive was a weathered P-51 rudder, painted deep crimson. In 1972, a reunion was held in Alabama, at Tuskegee, where it had all begun. Old pilots embraced one another, laughing through tears. Mechanics stood beside generals, all equal now in memory. The hangar that had once echoed with youthful ambition now filled with the voices of men who had earned peace the hard way. They told stories that had never been written down, of frozen engines over Austria, of flak that tore through wings, of the fear that crept in at 20,000 feet but never showed on the radio. They remembered the faces of those who hadn't come home, and when the day ended, they raised glasses of water, not wine, a gesture of respect for the comrades who could not join them. One of them, Charles Alfred Anderson, the instructor who had first taught them to fly, stood at the edge of the crowd. His hair was white now, his hands trembling slightly. Someone asked him what he thought of seeing his students again after all these years. Anderson smiled softly. "I always knew they could do it," he said. "I just needed the world to see." By the 1980s, the Red Tails were finally becoming recognized as American heroes. Congress issued official commendations. Schools were named in their honor. Children began to learn their story not as a footnote, but as a testament that courage and skill are born from opportunity, not privilege. Yet, even with the honors, there was a quiet melancholy among them. Too many of their brothers had died before the world said, "Thank you." Too many medals were pinned to empty uniforms. But those who lived carried their legacy with quiet pride, never bitterness. In 1995, at an air show in Alabama, a formation of modern F-16s streaked across the sky, each painted with red tails. As they passed overhead, one plane broke from the formation and climbed alone into the clouds, the traditional missing man salute. On the ground, veterans of the 332nd stood at attention, saluting back through tears. 50 years had passed since the war's end, yet in that moment it was as though time had folded upon itself. The past saluting the present, the student honoring the teacher. The skies were quieter now, but somewhere, deep within the roar of jet engines and the hum of modern flight, there still echoed the faint rhythmic pulse of propellers, the heartbeat of the men who had once painted the sky red. And though their P-51s were gone, the legacy of their discipline, their grace, and their unyielding faith endured, not in museums or medals, but in the very sky itself, which they had claimed for all who would follow. By the dawn of the 21st century, time had thinned their ranks. The once young men of Ramitelli were now grandfathers, their hair silver, their hands marked by age. Yet, when they gathered, when they spoke of the war, the years seemed to fall away. They were still pilots, their eyes sharp, their voices steady, their hearts unchanged. The nation, at last, was ready to listen. In 2007, more than 60 years after their last mission, hundreds of Tuskegee Airmen and their families were invited to Washington, D.C. They came in wheelchairs and on canes, wearing red jackets, medals glinting under the soft lights of the Capitol Rotunda. The U.S. Congress was about to present them with the Congressional Gold Medal, the highest civilian honor America could give. As the applause rose, many of the men simply bowed their heads. Some smiled, others wept quietly. It was not the sound of recognition they remembered. It was the silence of Ramitelli, the wind at 25,000 feet, the voice of a commander saying, "Stay with the bombers." President George W. Bush, standing before them, spoke plainly. The Tuskegee Airmen helped win a war, and they helped change our nation for the better, and for that we are grateful. Then he paused, looking out across the sea of veterans. One of you said, "We didn't know we were making history. We were just trying to fly and be treated like everybody else." Gentlemen, you did more than fly. You taught us how to soar. The crowd stood, and for the first time, the applause was for them alone. That night, as the veterans left the Capitol, reporters asked what the medal meant after so many decades. One man, a former mechanic named Walter Palmer, smiled softly and said, "It means we finally landed." Years later, their story would echo again in classrooms, museums, and films. Children who had never known war learned of the Red Tails and their courage. Teachers spoke of their discipline, how they never abandoned a bomber, never broke formation, never surrendered to hate. Their legacy became a lesson not just in aviation, but in humanity. In 2012, at the premiere of a film bearing their name, a new generation of pilots, Air Force cadets, both men and women, black and white, stood in uniform beside the last surviving Tuskegee Airmen. As the lights dimmed and the movie began, the veterans smiled quietly. On the screen, P-51 Mustangs roared across the sky once more, their tails burning red against the clouds. For a moment, time disappeared. After the credits rolled, one of the cadets turned to a veteran and said, "Sir, what did it feel like to fly?" The old man looked at him, eyes distant, then answered softly, "It felt like freedom, the kind you have to fight for, even when it's not given." That was the truth of their story. The Red Tails had never asked for sympathy, only for the chance to serve. They did not seek revenge for injustice, only justice through excellence. They proved that courage is not born from privilege, but from purpose, and that dignity, once earned, cannot be taken away. In a hangar at the National Museum of the U.S. Air Force, a single P-51 Mustang stands restored. Its body gleams silver. Its tail glows deep crimson. On the fuselage, painted in careful script, are 4 simple words. By request, Tuskegee Airmen. It was the call sign the bomber crews had once used when radioing for their escorts. Decades later, it remains both a tribute and a promise. Every year, school children visit the museum. They walk around the Mustang, looking up at the cockpit, reading the names etched on the wall beside it. Some whisper, some stare in silence. And somewhere in that silence, history breathes again. The sound of engines, the rush of wind, the faint echo of voices calling through static. Red Tails, you're with us. Outside, the sky stretches wide and endless. The same sky they once conquered, the same sky they claimed for all who would dare to rise. And though the last of them will one day fade into memory, their wings will never rest. Because the freedom they fought for lives not in monuments or medals, but in every soul that still believes in the promise of equality. Their mission began in segregation and ended in unity. Their struggle was born of doubt and ended in faith. Their courage once protected bombers through flak and fire, and now it guards the conscience of a nation. The red tails of their Mustangs no longer streak across the sky, but their color endures. Bright, defiant, eternal. It is the color of blood shed for freedom, the color of sacrifice, the color of courage. And so, whenever the sky turns red at sunset, one might imagine, just for a moment, the faint silhouette of a P-51 gliding through the light, steady, faithful, unwavering. The Red Tails, home at last.